Elijah Thompson adjusted the straps of his worn-out backpack and took a deep breath as the crowd of strangers bustled past him. The air smelled faintly of gasoline and freshly baked pretzels from a vendor cart across the street. It was just another busy afternoon on Maple Avenue, where the city's noise never seemed to pause. Elijah had come downtown to pick up some groceries for his mother, a routine errand that had become second nature since his father passed away 3 years ago. At 12 years old, he carried responsibilities heavier than most kids his age. As Elijah stood at the crosswalk waiting for the pedestrian signal to turn green, a quiet but distressed voice caught his attention. He turned his head and spotted an elderly woman standing a few feet away. She was small and frail, with silvery white hair tucked under a beige hat and a cane trembling in her hand. She clutched a small paper bag in her other hand, her expression a mix of worry and hesitation as she gazed at the stream of cars rushing by. "Excuse me, young man," she called out softly, her voice barely audible over the roar of the traffic. "Would you mind helping me across?" Elijah blinked, momentarily startled. He hadn't expected to be noticed, let alone asked for help. For a moment, he glanced at the other pedestrians standing nearby. Most of them were glued to their phones or staring straight ahead, indifferent to the woman's predicament. Elijah knew what it felt like to be invisible. He stepped forward. "Of course, ma'am," he said, offering a reassuring smile. "Here, take my arm." The woman hesitated briefly before looping her thin arm through his. "Thank you, dear. My name's Mrs. Abernathy," she said, her voice trembling as much as her cane. "I'm Elijah," he replied as they waited for the light to change. The seconds felt long, and Elijah could feel the impatient gazes of drivers waiting for the pedestrians to clear the road. When the signal finally blinked green, Elijah guided Mrs. Abernathy carefully onto the crosswalk. She moved slowly, her cane tapping against the asphalt with each step. Cars hummed with restrained impatience, their engines revving as if to urge them along. Elijah stayed close, shielding her from the rush of urban chaos as they made their way across. "Almost there," he said encouragingly when they reached the halfway point. Mrs. Abernathy nodded, her grip tightening on his arm. As they stepped onto the opposite curb, Mrs. Abernathy let out a sigh of relief. "Thank you so much, Elijah," she said, turning to look at him with watery blue eyes. "Not everyone would stop to help an old lady like me." "It's no problem," Elijah said, feeling an unexpected warmth spread through his chest. "Do you need help getting anywhere else?" No, dear. I'll be fine from here," Mrs. Abernathy replied, holding up the paper bag. "Just needed to pick up some medicine. But you've been so kind. I won't forget it." Elijah nodded and watched as she shuffled toward the entrance of a nearby pharmacy. He stayed for a moment, just to make sure she got inside safely, then turned to head back toward his neighborhood. The interaction left him with a strange sense of accomplishment, as if he had done something small but meaningful. By the time he reached home, the sun had dipped lower in the sky, casting golden hues over the modest row of houses. His mother, a waitress who worked long hours, was still at the diner. Elijah put away the groceries and started on his homework, but the memory of Mrs. Abernathy lingered in his mind. He wondered if she lived alone, or if she had family who looked after her. What he didn't know was that the same thoughts were running through Mrs. Abernathy's mind as she sat in her small apartment that evening. Touched by Elijah's kindness, she made a decision. She would not only remember the boy who helped her, she would find a way to repay him. And so, without Elijah knowing it, his small act of kindness had set a life-changing chain of events into motion. The morning sunlight streamed through the thin curtains of Elijah's room, painting soft patterns on the worn wooden floor. Elijah stirred awake to the sound of a gentle knock on the front door. He blinked, disoriented, before realizing it wasn't just part of his dream. His mother's voice called out from the kitchen, "Elijah, can you get that? I'm in the middle of making breakfast." Sliding out of bed, Elijah threw on his hoodie and shuffled to the door, still groggy. He pulled it open, expecting to see a delivery person or maybe a neighbor. Instead, standing on the small porch was Mrs. Abernathy, dressed in a neat navy coat with her cane resting lightly against her leg. Beside her was a tall, sharply dressed man with salt and pepper hair. His kind but commanding presence filled the doorway. "Elijah!" Mrs. Abernathy exclaimed with a delighted smile. "I hope I'm not intruding, dear." Elijah blinked, surprised. "Mrs. Abernathy, what are you doing here?" "This is my son James," she said, gesturing to the man beside her. "I told him all about how you helped me yesterday." James stepped forward and extended a hand. "You must be Elijah. Mom hasn't stopped talking about you," he said, his deep voice warm. "It's a pleasure to meet you." Elijah hesitated, then shook James's hand. His grip was firm, but not intimidating. Nice to meet you too," Elijah mumbled, still unsure what to make of the situation. "Do you want to come in?" "Oh, we wouldn't want to impose," Mrs. Abernathy began, but James interrupted with a chuckle. "We'd love to, if it's no trouble." Elijah opened the door wider, glancing toward the kitchen. His mother appeared, wiping her hands on a dish towel. Her expression shifted from curiosity to polite concern as she took in their unexpected visitors. "Good morning," she said, her voice cautious but welcoming. "I'm Angela Thompson. Can I help you with something?" Mrs. Abernathy stepped forward, her cane tapping softly against the floor. "Oh dear, it's nothing to worry about. I just wanted to thank your son properly. He was such a blessing yesterday." Angela's eyebrows lifted in surprise, and she glanced at Elijah. "What did you do?" "I just helped her cross the street," Elijah said, scratching the back of his neck. "Not just," Mrs. Abernathy insisted. "He was so kind, so patient. You've raised a wonderful young man." Angela smiled, a mix of pride and modesty in her expression. "Well, that's sweet of you to say. Thank you." James cleared his throat, stepping into the conversation. "Mom told me the whole story, and it reminded me of how I grew up. We didn't have much back then, but there were always people who looked out for us, and that made all the difference. So, when I heard about Elijah, I thought we should stop by and see if there's anything we can do for him." Angela's posture stiffened slightly. "That's very generous of you, but we're doing just fine." "I'm sure you are," James said diplomatically. "But kindness deserves kindness in return, and sometimes a little help can open doors that might otherwise stay shut." Elijah looked between his mom and their visitors, sensing the unspoken tension. Angela was proud and fiercely independent, but something about James's calm sincerity seemed to soften her stance. "We appreciate the thought," she said after a pause. "Really, we do." "Maybe just hear me out," James offered. He pulled a business card from his pocket and handed it to her. "I run a mentorship program for young people. It's not charity, I promise. It's about creating opportunities. If Elijah's interested, I'd love to have him visit our office. No strings attached." Angela studied the card, her lips pressed into a thin line. After a moment, she handed it to Elijah. "It's up to you," she said quietly. Elijah glanced at the card, then at James. He didn't know much about mentorship programs or opportunities, but he did know one thing. Yesterday had been ordinary until he met Mrs. Abernathy. Now his life seemed to be tilting towards something different, something bigger than he'd imagined. "I'll think about it," he said cautiously. "That's all I ask," James replied with a smile. "And if you change your mind, just give me a call." Before they left, Mrs. Abernathy reached out and gently patted Elijah's arm. "Thank you again, dear. You've got a good heart. Don't ever lose that." As the door closed behind them, Elijah turned to his mother, still holding the business card. Her expression was hard to read, a mix of worry and hope. "Well," Angela said finally, "looks like your good deed didn't go unnoticed." Elijah nodded, turning the card over in his hands. He didn't know what he would do yet, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like something exciting was on the horizon. The following week passed in a blur for Elijah. Between school, helping his mother around the house, and wondering about James Abernathy's mentorship program, his mind felt like a storm of questions. What kind of opportunity could someone like James really offer? Did people like him and Mrs. Abernathy really care? Or was this just some fleeting act of charity? By Friday afternoon, Elijah's curiosity had outgrown his hesitation. He pulled out James's business card from his backpack. The embossed lettering gleamed under the faint light of the kitchen as he dialed the number on their landline. After 3 rings, a crisp voice answered, "James Abernathy speaking." Hi," Elijah stammered. "It's Elijah. We met last week with your mom?" "Elijah, I'm glad you called," James said, his tone warm. "What can I do for you?" "I was just wondering if I could check out that program you mentioned." "Absolutely," James replied without hesitation. "How about tomorrow? I'll send a car to pick you up." Elijah nearly dropped the phone. "A car?" James laughed lightly. "Don't worry, just a ride to my place. I'll text you the details." Elijah hung up, nerves tangling with excitement. The next morning, a sleek black sedan pulled up outside his house. Elijah had never been in anything so polished before. The driver, a kind-faced man named Carl, opened the door for him with a smile. The drive to James's estate was surreal. The city faded behind them as they entered a sprawling suburban neighborhood filled with manicured lawns and towering iron gates. When they finally arrived, Elijah stepped out of the car and stared in awe. The Abernathy estate was a vision of elegance, an expansive property with white stone walls, wide verandas, and lush gardens that seemed to stretch endlessly. Mrs. Abernathy was waiting on the steps to greet him. "Elijah!" she called, her cane tapping against the polished stone. "So good to see you again." "Hi, Mrs. Abernathy," Elijah replied, trying not to let his nervousness show. "James is in the study," she said, gesturing toward the front door. "Come on in." Inside, the house was even more impressive. High ceilings, gleaming wood floors, and walls lined with bookshelves and artwork made Elijah feel like he'd stepped into another world. James met him in the study, a spacious room filled with leather chairs and sunlight pouring through tall windows. "Welcome, Elijah," James said, shaking his hand. "Thanks for coming." Elijah looked around, his eyes wide. "This is your house?" James chuckled. "It's home, but it wasn't always like this. I grew up in a neighborhood not so different from yours." "Really?" Elijah asked, skeptical. "Really," James confirmed, sitting down. "That's why I started the mentorship program. I know how hard it can be to see beyond what's right in front of you. Sometimes you need someone to show you there's more out there." Elijah nodded slowly, still unsure where he fit into all this. "Let me show you something," James said, leading him to another room. It was a smaller office filled with photos, framed awards, and a corkboard covered in handwritten notes and newspaper clippings. "These are all kids I've worked with over the years," James explained, pointing to the photos. "Some went on to start businesses, some became teachers, and others just found ways to give back to their communities. They didn't all have it easy, but they worked hard and took the opportunities that came their way." Elijah studied the faces on the wall, feeling both inspired and overwhelmed. Could he really be one of them? "You've got potential, Elijah," James said, breaking into his thoughts. "I can see it. If you're willing to work for it, I'd like to help you." "What kind of help?" Elijah asked, still wary. "For starters, I'd like to enroll you in one of the best schools in the city," James said. "You'll get access to better teachers, better resources, and a network that can open doors you didn't even know existed." Elijah's heart raced. "But I can't. My mom needs me to help out at home." James nodded. "I get that. But think about what this could mean for both of you in the long run. A better education could give you the tools to help your family in ways you never imagined." The offer felt too big, too unreal. Elijah didn't know what to say. "You don't have to decide right now," James added, sensing his hesitation. Take your time. Talk it over with your mom. Whatever you decide, know that this door is open for you. In that night, back at home, Elijah sat at the kitchen table with his mother. He explained everything about the estate, the mentorship program, and the offer to attend a new school. Angela listened quietly, her face unreadable. When he finished, she let out a long sigh. That's a lot to think about. I know, Elijah said, his voice barely above a whisper. But I think it could be a good thing. For both of us. Angela stared at her son for a long moment, then reached out and squeezed his hand. If you think this is the right thing for you, I'll support it. Elijah nodded, his heart swelling with determination. For the first time, he felt like the future wasn't just something to survive. It was something he could shape. The morning came quickly, and Elijah couldn't shake the mix of excitement and nerves coursing through him. His mother had agreed to the mentorship opportunity, and today was the day he'd officially visit the prestigious school James Abernathy had mentioned. Elijah wasn't sure what to expect, but he knew one thing. This was a chance he couldn't waste. When the black sedan arrived to pick him up, Elijah grabbed his backpack and took a deep breath. His mother stood in the doorway, her arms crossed, but her expression soft. "You're going to do great," she said, giving him a quick hug. "Just be yourself." "I will," Elijah promised, though he wasn't entirely sure who himself was in a world like this. The ride to the school felt like stepping into another universe. The car pulled up to an ornate iron gate that opened slowly to reveal a sprawling campus of brick buildings, meticulously maintained gardens, and students strolling the grounds in crisp uniforms. Elijah's old school, with its chipped paint and overcrowded classrooms, felt like a distant memory compared to this. James was waiting near the entrance, dressed in a tailored suit, but with his usual approachable smile. "Elijah," he called, walking toward him. "Welcome to Ridgeway Academy." Elijah looked around, his mouth slightly open. "This place is huge," James chuckled. "It can feel that way at first, but you'll get used to it. Come on, I'll show you around." The tour was overwhelming. James led Elijah through state-of-the-art science labs, a library filled with books that seemed to stretch into infinity, and classrooms equipped with interactive boards and advanced tech. The students looked confident, chatting in groups or walking with purpose, and Elijah couldn't help but feel like an outsider. At the end of the tour, they stopped in a large office with a polished oak desk. A woman in her mid-50s, with sharp eyes and a warm smile, stood to greet them. "Elijah, this is Principal Bradford," James introduced. "She's the head of Ridgeway Academy." "It's a pleasure to meet you, Elijah," she said, shaking his hand firmly. "James has told me wonderful things about you." Elijah nodded, unsure of what to say. He wasn't used to adults looking at him like he mattered. Principal Bradford gestured for him to sit. "James has shared his intention to sponsor your education here, and after reviewing his recommendation and your records, we're happy to offer you a place at Ridgeway." Elijah's heart thudded in his chest. "Really? Just like that?" "Just like that," James said, smiling. "You've earned it, Elijah. This is a chance to show what you're capable of." Principal Bradford leaned forward. "Of course, it'll be an adjustment. Ridgeway's curriculum is rigorous, and you'll be surrounded by peers who've had different opportunities. But if you're willing to put in the work, I believe you'll thrive here." Elijah swallowed hard. I'll try my best." "That's all we ask," Bradford said. "We'll start with a probationary period, just to make sure it's a good fit. How does that sound?" Elijah nodded. "It sounds amazing." After the meeting, James walked Elijah back to the car. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Nervous," Elijah admitted, "but excited." "That's normal," James said. "Remember, you belong here as much as anyone else. Don't let anyone make you feel otherwise." As the car pulled away, Elijah watched the school fade into the distance. His mind raced with thoughts of what lay ahead: new teachers, new classmates, new challenges. He felt the weight of expectations, but also a spark of determination. When Elijah got home, his mother was waiting anxiously in the kitchen. "How did it go?" she asked. "They accepted me," Elijah said, unable to hide his grin. Angela's eyes widened. "That's wonderful, Elijah." "They said it'll be hard," he added, his smile fading slightly. "What if I mess up?" Angela knelt down so she was eye level with him. "You're not going to mess up, and even if things get tough, you're smart, you're capable, and you've got people who believe in you." Elijah nodded, feeling a lump in his throat. "Thanks, Mom." The next week, Elijah stepped into Ridgeway Academy for his first day. The uniform, a white button-up shirt, navy blazer and tie, felt stiff and unfamiliar, and he couldn't shake the feeling that everyone was staring at him. He kept his head down, clutching his schedule as he navigated the labyrinth of hallways. By lunchtime, Elijah had already been called on twice in class and had stumbled over an answer in history. He felt out of place, like a puzzle piece jammed into the wrong box. He carried his lunch tray to an empty table in the corner of the cafeteria, avoiding eye contact. As he picked at his sandwich, a voice interrupted his thoughts. "Mind if I sit here?" Elijah looked up to see a boy about his age, with curly brown hair and glasses. He wore the Ridgeway uniform like it was second nature, but his smile was friendly. "Sure," Elijah said. "I'm Noah," the boy said, setting down his tray. "You're new, right? I saw you in English this morning." "Yeah, I'm Elijah." "Cool," Noah said. "Ridgeway can be kind of overwhelming at first, but you'll get the hang of it." "Thanks," Elijah said, grateful for the kindness. As they talked, Elijah began to relax. Maybe this place wasn't so impossible after all. Elijah quickly realized that attending Ridgeway Academy wasn't just about showing up. It was a test of endurance. The curriculum was far more intense than anything he'd experienced at his old school. His first week alone felt like a marathon of essays, problem sets, and pop quizzes. Each night, he'd come home exhausted, barely able to keep his eyes open as he worked through assignments at the kitchen table. His mother noticed the strain, but knew better than to press him about it. Instead, she offered quiet support, leaving snacks and tea by his side as he studied late into the night. "Just remember," she said one evening, "you don't have to prove anything to anyone except yourself." Elijah nodded, appreciating her words, even if they didn't fully sink in. The weight of fitting into this new world felt heavier than he could explain. At school, Elijah struggled to find his rhythm. His classes were full of students who seemed to understand everything immediately, while he often felt 2 steps behind. In math, he wrestled with formulas that everyone else solved with ease. In literature, he found himself intimidated by classmates who could analyze Shakespeare like seasoned scholars. The social dynamics didn't help. Though Noah had been friendly, many of the other students seemed distant, as if unsure how to approach someone like Elijah. He caught the occasional curious glance or whispered comment, and while no one was overtly unkind, he couldn't shake the feeling of being an outsider. One day in history class, the teacher, Mr. Calloway, asked a question about the civil rights movement. Elijah hesitated, then raised his hand to answer. When he finished, a girl sitting near the front turned around, her expression skeptical. "Did your old school even teach that?" she asked, her tone light but her words cutting. Elijah felt heat rush to his face. "Yeah, we learned that," he said quietly. Mr. Calloway cleared his throat, cutting off the girl before she could say anything else. But the damage was done. Elijah spent the rest of the class staring at his notebook, wishing he could disappear. At home, things weren't much easier. His responsibilities hadn't disappeared just because he was at Ridgeway. After school, he helped his mom with groceries, cleaned the apartment, and looked after the neighbors' young kids for extra money. By the time he sat down to study, his energy was spent. One evening, as Elijah struggled through a math problem, his mother sat down across from him. "You've been quiet lately," she said. "Everything okay?" Elijah hesitated. "I don't know if I can do this, Mom. Everyone at school is smarter than me. They're richer, too. It's like I don't belong there." Angela reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "Listen to me, Elijah. You've earned this. Just because their journey looks different doesn't mean you don't deserve to be there. You're going to have to work harder, sure, but you've got something they don't." "What's that?" Elijah asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Heart," Angela said firmly. "You've got grit. That'll take you farther than money or fancy schools ever could." Elijah nodded, her words giving him a flicker of hope. The next day, Elijah resolved to push through. He sought out Noah during lunch, and they started studying together after school. Noah, who excelled in math, patiently explained concepts that had baffled Elijah in class. "See?" Noah said one afternoon after Elijah solved a particularly tough equation. "You're getting it. You're not behind. You just need practice." Encouraged by Noah's support, Elijah began to participate more in class. Though he still felt self-conscious, he noticed that the more he spoke up, the more confident he became. His teachers took note, and some even offered extra help during office hours. Even outside of academics, Elijah started to find his footing. He joined the debate club at Noah's suggestion, and though his first practice was nerve-wracking, he discovered he had a knack for crafting arguments. The club members, impressed by his perspective, welcomed him warmly. Despite his progress, balancing school and home life remained a challenge. One evening, Elijah came home to find his mother sitting at the kitchen table, looking at a stack of unpaid bills. The sight reminded him of why he had to succeed, not just for himself, but for her. "Do you need help with anything?" he asked, dropping his bag by the door. Angela shook her head quickly. "You focus on your studies. I've got this." But Elijah knew she didn't, not entirely. Determined to ease her burden, he started tutoring kids in the neighborhood on weekends. It wasn't much, but the extra money helped cover groceries and small expenses. Weeks turned into months, and though the road wasn't easy, Elijah began to see the fruits of his labor. His grades improved steadily, and he started to feel less like an outsider at Ridgeway. Noah remained a loyal friend, and even some of the other students warmed up to him as they saw how hard he worked. One afternoon, James Abernathy called him into his office at the mentorship program. "How's everything going, Elijah?" James asked, leaning back in his chair. "It's tough," Elijah admitted, "but I think I'm getting the hang of it." James smiled. "I knew you would. You've got something special, Elijah. Just remember, this isn't about being the best right away. It's about growing into the person you're meant to be." Elijah nodded, feeling the weight of those words. He still had a long way to go, but for the first time, he believed he could handle whatever came next. Elijah's progress at Ridgeway Academy wasn't linear. For every success, there seemed to be a new challenge waiting to test him. The rigorous curriculum continued to push him to his limits, and while he was starting to keep pace academically, the social hurdles were harder to overcome. The pressure builds one. Cold Monday morning, Elijah arrived at school to find a list posted outside the debate club's meeting room. It was the roster for an upcoming inter-school debate tournament, and his name was on it. His stomach dropped. He enjoyed the club, but the idea of competing in front of an audience was terrifying. "You're on the list," Noah said, clapping him on the back. "That's huge." "Yeah," Elijah muttered, staring at his name. "It's huge, all right." Noah frowned. "You'll do fine. Just prepare, and you'll crush it." But Elijah wasn't so sure. The tournament was only 2 weeks away, and balancing preparation with his already packed schedule felt impossible. He spent late nights poring over debate strategies, but self-doubt crept in at every turn. The turning point. 2 days before the tournament, Elijah had a particularly rough history class. The teacher asked a question about the Civil War, and when Elijah answered, a boy named Marcus, a star student with an air of arrogance, interrupted. "Actually, that's not entirely correct," Marcus said, launching into an explanation that made Elijah's answer seem simplistic. The teacher nodded approvingly. "Good point, Marcus." Elijah's cheeks burned as the class moved on. At lunch, he sat alone, pushing his food around his tray. He wasn't just embarrassed, he felt outclassed. What was he even doing at Ridgeway? How could he compete in a debate when he couldn't even hold his own in class? That evening, as Elijah sat at the kitchen table, his mom noticed his silence. "What's on your mind?" she asked. Elijah hesitated before blurting out, "I don't belong at Ridgeway, Mom. Everyone there is smarter, richer, better than me. I'm just wasting my time." Angela set down her tea and fixed him with a steady gaze. "Elijah Thompson, don't you ever say that again. You've worked harder than anyone I know to get where you are. So what if it's tough? That doesn't mean you don't belong." "I messed up in class today," he muttered. "And there's this debate tournament. I'm going to embarrass myself." Angela leaned forward. "Listen to me. Success isn't about never failing. It's about getting back up every time you do. You've already proven you're capable. Now you just have to believe it." Her words stuck with him, and that night, Elijah approached his debate preparation with renewed determination. He spent hours researching his topic, practicing arguments in front of the mirror, and even enlisting Noah to help him refine his points. The tournament. On the day of the debate, Elijah's nerves were electric as he stepped onto the stage with his team. The auditorium buzzed with energy, packed with students and teachers from multiple schools. Marcus, sitting in the audience, smirked at him, and Elijah felt his confidence waver. But when it was his turn to speak, something shifted. He remembered his mother's words and the late nights he'd spent preparing. Taking a deep breath, he began to present his argument. His voice was shaky at first, but as he got into his points, the words flowed naturally. He made eye contact with the judges, gestured confidently, and even rebutted a point made by the opposing team. By the end, Elijah's heart was pounding, but the applause from the audience told him he hadn't failed. When the results were announced, Ridgeway placed second, an impressive finish for Elijah's first competition. "You were amazing," Noah said afterward. "See? Told you could do it." Even Marcus, though grudgingly, nodded in acknowledgement. "Not bad, Thompson." Elijah grinned, feeling a surge of pride. For the first time, he truly believed he belonged at Ridgeway. Il faut savoir finding balance. While the debate tournament was a turning point, challenges still loomed. Elijah continued to struggle with balancing his schoolwork, extracurriculars, and responsibilities at home. There were nights when exhaustion overwhelmed him, and mornings when the thought of facing another day at Ridgeway felt insurmountable. But he also started to see the value of leaning on others. Noah remained a steadfast friend, and his teachers noticed his efforts, offering guidance and support. James Abernathy checked in regularly, reminding Elijah of the bigger picture. "Elijah," James said during one of their meetings, "you're not just working for today, you're building a foundation for the future. Don't let the hard days make you lose sight of that." Those words became a mantra for Elijah. Slowly but surely, he began to find a rhythm. He learned to prioritize, to ask for help when he needed it, and to forgive himself when things didn't go perfectly. A lesson in kindness. One afternoon, as Elijah left school, he saw a younger student struggling to carry a stack of books. Without thinking, he stepped forward to help. "Thanks," the boy said, looking up at him. "I thought I was going to drop them." "No problem," Elijah replied, smiling. As he walked home, he thought about how far he'd come. A year ago, he might not have noticed that kid, too consumed by his own struggles. But now, he understood the power of small acts of kindness, how they could change someone's day, or even their life. Elijah walked down the familiar streets of his old neighborhood, the weight of his Ridgeway backpack feeling lighter than usual. It had been months since he started at the academy, and though the struggles hadn't vanished, he'd learned to manage them with a quiet determination. Today, he wasn't heading home straight after school. Instead, he was meeting a group of younger kids at the community center, a place he'd spent many afternoons before Ridgeway. The center, once a bustling hub of activity, had fallen into disrepair over the years. The basketball hoops were rusted, the library shelves nearly empty, and the after-school programs almost non-existent. Elijah had always known the place deserved better, but it wasn't until recently that he believed he could do something about it. The idea had come to him during one of his late-night study sessions. As he wrestled with an essay about civic responsibility, he realized that success wasn't just about personal achievements. It was about using those achievements to make a difference. Ridgeway had opened doors for him, but what good were those opportunities if he didn't use them to help others? With that thought in mind, he approached James Abernathy for advice. James, impressed by Elijah's initiative, not only encouraged the idea, but offered to support it. When Elijah arrived at the community center, a small group of kids had already gathered, their faces lighting up when they saw him. They ranged in age from 6 to 12, and most of them reminded Elijah of himself a few years ago, eager to learn but unsure of where to start. He greeted them warmly and led them inside, where he'd set up a makeshift classroom in one of the unused rooms. The room wasn't much: a few old desks, a whiteboard he'd salvaged, and a handful of donated books. But to the kids, it was a world of possibilities. For the next hour, Elijah helped them with homework, taught them basic math skills, and even shared stories from Ridgeway that sparked their curiosity about what they could achieve. After the session, one of the kids, a shy boy named Malcolm, tugged at Elijah's sleeve. "Do you really think I could go to a school like Ridgeway one day?" he asked quietly. Elijah knelt to his level, looking him in the eye. "I don't just think so, Malcolm. I know so. You're smart, and you've got what it takes. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Malcolm smiled, and in that moment, Elijah saw a reflection of his younger self, the kid who needed someone to believe in him. As the weeks went on, Elijah's project grew. Word spread about the free tutoring sessions, and more kids started showing up. With James's help, Elijah secured funding to repair the basketball court and restock the library. Local businesses donated supplies, and even some of Elijah's classmates from Ridgeway volunteered to help. The community center transformed into a vibrant space once again, filled with laughter, learning, and hope. Elijah didn't just see the change, he felt it. It wasn't just about improving the center, it was about showing these kids that someone cared, that their dreams were worth chasing. One evening, as Elijah packed up after a particularly busy session, Mrs. Abernathy appeared at the door. She'd heard about his efforts and insisted on seeing it for herself. "You've done something remarkable here, Elijah," she said, her eyes glistening with pride. "You've taken what you've been given and turned it into something that will last." Elijah smiled, feeling the weight of her words. She was right. This wasn't just about the center. It was about creating a ripple effect of kindness and opportunity, the same way her simple request for help months ago had changed his life. By the end of the year, Elijah's project had become a cornerstone of the neighborhood. The center hosted workshops, sports events, and even a scholarship program funded by James's mentorship organization. Elijah juggled his responsibilities at Ridgeway and the center with determination, never losing sight of why he'd started. He realized that giving back wasn't just about charity, it was about empowerment, about showing others what was possible. And in helping others find their potential, Elijah discovered his own. Years passed, and the once chaotic streets of Elijah's childhood neighborhood had begun to change. The community center he'd revitalized as a Ridgeway student was now a thriving hub, its walls freshly painted and its rooms bustling with activity. Elijah, now in his 20s and dressed sharply in a tailored suit, stood outside the center, holding a small bouquet of flowers. The occasion was bittersweet. Mrs. Abernathy, the woman who had sparked his journey, had passed away the week before. Today, the community had gathered to dedicate the center in her honor. As people trickled in, Elijah looked around and marveled at the faces he saw. Kids who had once been part of his tutoring program now stood as young adults, many of them in college or working. Malcolm, the shy boy who once doubted himself, waved from across the room. He'd just completed his first year at Ridgeway Academy, attending on a scholarship funded by the very program Elijah had helped establish. When the ceremony began, Elijah was invited to the stage to speak. His heart pounded as he approached the podium, but as he looked out at the crowd, his mother, James Abernathy, former teachers, and countless familiar faces, he felt a wave of calm. He cleared his throat, gripping the edges of the podium. "Mrs. Abernathy wasn't just a kind woman who asked me for help one afternoon," he began. "She was the person who reminded me of the power of small actions. When I helped her cross the street, I thought it was just a moment, an ordinary thing. But that moment grew into something extraordinary, something that changed the course of my life." Elijah paused, scanning the room. "And it wasn't just about me. That single act of kindness sparked a chain reaction that has reached all of you in some way. Whether you're here because of the programs we started, the scholarships we funded, or the space we've created together, it all started with her." Mrs. Abernathy believed in kindness, in community, and in lifting each other up. He gestured toward the plaque mounted on the wall, which bore Mrs. Abernathy's name. "This center is dedicated to her memory, not just for what she did for me, but for what she inspired in all of us. Let her story remind us that even the smallest actions can have the biggest impact." The room erupted into applause as Elijah stepped down. Angela, his mother, met him with a proud hug, her eyes brimming with tears. "You've come so far," she whispered, "and Mrs. Abernathy would be so proud." Later that evening, after the crowd had dispersed and the lights in the center dimmed, Elijah stepped outside into the cool night air. He walked slowly, his footsteps echoing against the quiet street, until he reached the crosswalk where it had all begun. The traffic light glowed red, and Elijah paused, leaning against the pole. As he stood there, a young boy approached, struggling with a tattered backpack that seemed too heavy for his small frame. The boy hesitated at the edge of the curb, looking nervous as cars zipped by. "Need some help?" Elijah asked, stepping forward with a smile. The boy looked up, startled, but then nodded. "Yeah, thanks." Elijah offered his arm, and together they crossed the street. When they reached the other side, the boy looked up at him. "Thanks, mister. You didn't have to do that." Elijah crouched to the boy's level, his smile widening. "Sometimes the smallest help can make the biggest difference," he said. "You remember that, okay?" The boy nodded and hurried off, disappearing into the night. Elijah stood there for a moment longer, staring after him, before turning and walking back toward the center. Life, he realized, had a way of coming full circle. And as long as kindness remained at its core, the cycle would never truly end.